I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and today it's time to say goodbye to our long-term Mercedes-Benz C200 Edition C, this elegant looking grey sedan behind me. Now, I've run this C200 for the last 6 months and I've taken it everywhere with me. On road trips around Australia, all of my commuting in town, here in Sydney, we've used it as a support vehicle for so much of the content we've made here on the channel. It's safe to say that I and the other team members at Chasing Cars have gotten to know this car really well. And I can sincerely say, this is the saddest I've been about handing back a long-term test car. The C200 W206 generation is such a peach of a vehicle if you get the specification right. And to understand what I mean by that, there's a video on the channel which is a buyer's guide for the C-Class to make sure that you don't make common mistakes that can end up leaving the C200 as not as desirable as it could be. In today's video though, I'm going to tell you the 5 things that I've loved about my long-term Mercedes-Benz C200 and the 5 things that haven't been so good and that Mercedes should improve in the future. But to start with, let's talk about my favorite thing about this car. Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by Budget Direct. My favorite thing about this C200 has been its serene ride quality, and that comes from the fact that we optioned this car with the Edition C package, which is only available with 18-inch wheels. It's the smallest you can get in Australia for this car. It's giving you a chunky bit of rubber in the tyre, and we've also got passive dampers, which is the best C-Class suspension system. The adaptive dampers actually make it boaty in comfort and then overly stiff in sport. So what you want is the passive standard dampers, where it has a brilliant Mercedes-Benz-esque ride quality that feels just right. The reason that they've been able to do that is the C-Class has targeted a balance which is more about comfort than it is about sport. That's exactly what this car should be about. It'll still absolutely hustle, and I'll talk about its agility in a minute, but in terms of ride, it is serene, and that's also joined by a super quiet cabin that makes commuting and life with this car in general really relaxing. A surprise for us at our Car of the Year testing last year was that the C200 was such a sufficient engine. In fact, all of our judges preferred it to the more expensive C300. The C200 is a 1.5 litre turbo petrol 4-cylinder. It's a Mercedes engine, not a Renault engine. It makes 150 kilowatts of power, 300 newton meters of torque. That was good enough for a 6.97 second sprint from 0 to 100 in our independent performance testing. But the engine also sounds good, and it's a silky partner to the 9-speed torque converter automatic transmission and rear-wheel drive in this car. It's balanced, it's reasonably sprightly, and it's nice and refined. A real surprise for us when we first got our hands on the new C-Class was its agility. It's surprisingly fun to drive with lovely steering. It's lighter than the steering on a BMW, but super direct, good communication from the road. The car hooks in well, and the chassis is super balanced. You can definitely tell it's rear drive when you're getting up it for the rent. It has good handling without compromising comfy ride quality, and I love that. While the C200 delivers phenomenal highway range, over 1,000 kilometers, because it's so frugal at high speeds, delivering a sub 6 litre per 100k economy, you can't say the same for the urban fuel consumption, which is just under 10 litres per 100k. So the difference between highway and urban in this car is more significant than some. That brings the range down, it brings your ownership costs up, but if you're the kind of person that does a lot of road trips, a lot of highway miles, you're going to get really good consumption and range out of the C200. One thing I've really gotten on with in the new C-Class is the interior package. It's presentable, particularly if you go for a lighter color like I did with this beige Artico on the C200 Edition C, but it's laid out in a functional manner, and most of the controls are where you expect and they're easy to use. In an era where plenty of cars are adding technology for technology's sake, the C-Class actually feels like Mercedes have thought about the functions you're going to use most frequently, and they're at least accessible, even if a few too many of them are located within touch buttons rather than hardware buttons. A case in point is the climate controls. It's in the touchscreen, but the climate panel is always accessible, so it's within easy reach from the driver's seat, and of course you've got voice control too. If you go for the Edition C like I did, you get an easier to use steering wheel with bigger, clearer buttons. The AMG line has to make do with tiny little shortcut buttons on tiny little spokes, which is quite annoying and frustrating at times, particularly if you're a bit short-sighted. Likewise, the twin screens run fairly intuitive software by Mercedes, but the car also has wireless smartphone mirroring that boots up almost straight away and is relatively, if not perfectly, reliable. Likewise, the material quality in here is better than the previous generation, but it's not quite a match for the BMW 3 Series in terms of outright build quality. One of the downsides about the cabin of the C200 is that it hasn't quite gotten back to the vault-like quality of the W204 generation C-Class that lasted from 2007 to 2013. Quality is better than the previous gen W205 C-Class that ended its run relatively recently. You can tell that in finishes like the knurling and the metals used here. Everything feels a grade more expensive. But unfortunately, one thing that has remained from the previous gen C-Class is some brittle plastics that tend to heat up in the sun and then crack in an uncouth and loud manner as the vehicle starts to cool down when you're running the air conditioning. And if I just lean in here to the plastics on the dash, so you can hear it through my microphone, you can kind of hear that cracking noise if you press on them. Unfortunately, when you drive off on a hot day, that noise comes through by itself, but it does settle down after about 10 minutes of cooling down. This C-Class is the sedan version, and although its boot is acceptable, a little smaller than the 3 Series or the A4, one of the big detriments of the current generation C-Class is that there's no wagon version sold in Australia. Now, I'm a wagon guy, I own a station wagon myself, so I appreciate the form factor. I get that not everybody likes wagons, more people prefer SUVs, but for those of us, the small club of people that love a station wagon for its car-like driving dynamics, lower set driving position, and big boot accessible through a large back door, the fact that Mercedes refuses to sell its Australian customers a wagon is a disappointment, especially when the BMW, the Audi, the Volvo, and the Genesis are all still offered with a station wagon option in this segment. One of the most lovable things about the new C-Class, and especially this C200 Edition C, is that it has its own character. Finally, once again, the C-Class is not trying to be the BMW 3 Series or the Audi A4. This is a Mercedes-Benz, and particularly if you equip it in the way that I have, it plays to its strengths as a Mercedes-Benz. I've already spoken about the serene ride comfort, the high levels of refinement, and the quality interior that you get with this vehicle, but through and through, from its appearance to the way the interior presents itself, to especially the way its ride and handling balance is resolved in favor of having comfort with your agility, this is a Mercedes that's worthy of the three-pointed star. Some of the brand's cheaper vehicles than this, are not quite there in my opinion, but this one is a real Mercedes-Benz. One unusual downside of the C-Class is that Mercedes-Benz has not done enough in Australia to make this vehicle affordable to service. Not only does the Genesis G70 have complimentary servicing for its first 5 years, but the BMW 3 Series and Audi A4 are much cheaper in terms of their cut price servicing or servicing plan deals that you can buy with the car. In the case of the C-Class, you've got to shell out over $5,000 on top of the purchase price of the vehicle for a prepaid 5-year service plan. But because this vehicle has really long service intervals, technically you can drive this car much further in terms of distance between annual maintenance checkups. Of course, many people will prefer to do their service at shorter kilometers though. The big downside of the new C-Class is the price. It's quite a lot more expensive than the previous model to buy, and to add insult to injury, Mercedes Australia has adopted an agency dealer model with a national fixed price for its cars, but not a national drive-away price, which would be easier and clearer for customers. So this vehicle is $78,900 before on-road costs. So it's about $85,000 drive away, and then our car has a couple of modest options on top of that as well, taking it closer to $90,000 drive away. Now that's an awful lot for a 1.5 litre turbo. Thankfully, the C200's case is saved by the fact that the engine is remarkably good, the ride quality is excellent, and the agility is really enjoyable. So as a driver's car, it's still good, even though it's the entry-level version. But, you know, 10 years ago, you could get a base model C-Class for a lot closer to 60 grand than 90 grand. Inflation is a thing, but you know, it's food for thought, isn't it? Last year, on the 2022 Chasing Cars Car of the Year testing program, the judges bestowed the new gen W206 Mercedes C-Class with our coveted Gold Star Award for eminent achievement. Even though it didn't take out the overall Car of the Year title, we loved the new C-Class at our Car of the Year testing, and we wanted to get one as a long-termer to see whether that honeymoon ended quickly or whether the love continued over 6 months. Well, in the case of the C200 Edition C in particular, I can tell you it's been the latter. I've loved this car and I wish I didn't have to hand it back. although it does have negatives, all cars have their downsides, and I've taken you through 5 of them today. I think the 5 positives about this car really outweigh the cons. Now, if you haven't seen it already, the next video from this series that you should watch is my C-Class buyer's guide, because in that video I explain why the C200 is the best engine for this car, the cheapest passive suspension is the best ride quality for this car, and why the C43 in particular isn't worth the big step up over the regular C-Class models. So make sure you catch that video to understand how to make the C-Class as good as it can be, just like this one, where I really do think we struck gold. Now, very keen to hear your opinions, so let us know down below this video. While you're there, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.